Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm great. We have been asked, probably more than any other question we've been asked about, was taking on the topic of emergencies. I probably have been a little bit apprehensive to take on this because I know there's going to be many differing opinions, and we would love the conversation, whether via email or social media. Let's talk through these things to hopefully help pilots. We've obviously talked a lot of things related to the killing zone and what Paul Craig said and decision making, but I think there is still a big gap in what we can talk about to help aviators make better decisions during what could be perceived as an emergency, whether it is or isn't. I think the person that probably wrote in the longest request for this had all kinds of questions. Can you help me understand when it is emergency, when it isn't an emergency? What I should do, what I shouldn't do. And I think there's so many things that get wrapped around every scenario that we could talk about. It's impossible to answer those questions yes or no. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I used to, when I was an active CFI, I used to tell my students, when in doubt, don't. And we're talking about weather decisions. If you're sitting here trying to make a decision, oh, geez, should I go? I don't know. Well, the fact that you're sitting there having that conversation, maybe with yourself, probably tells you that you shouldn't go. I would say within declaring an emergency, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything to declare an emergency. Now, you may have to answer to it, and you may have to explain yourself why you did it and what your thought process was. But I can't imagine any situation where you declare it an emergency and then it's like calling the police or calling 911. Bobby and I were talking about a health scare I had several years ago. I thought I was having a heart attack, and I went to the hospital, went to the ER, and boy, you tell them you're having chest pains and they get you go to the front of the line. And I went in and they checked everything and actually kept me overnight and released me the next day, and everything was fine. I went to a cardiologist, had this full cardio workup, and the cardiologist referred to my heart as disgustingly healthy. He said, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong, and we determined that it was indigestion. Had some spicy food the night before, but other than the time investment, and my insurance company paid some money for all that, but it was peace of mind. I would much rather do that than not do that and be in a bad situation at home. So as far as declaring an emergency, if you're thinking about it, it's probably worth declaring an emergency.
Yeah, and I don't think that we could tell you each of those scenarios, but what we thought we would do today is kind of talk through 3 or 4 things that we think you may experience during your flight training, during your student or private pilot era of training, that may help you think through how you are going to respond to those situations, and maybe some thoughts that you can draw on that in that situation that might help you do better to get yourself out of that situation. So really the few, let's go through each one of them one at a time. One of the things that's probably going to happen in these older aircraft to all of us while we're flying is we're going to lose one of the radios, if not both of the radios. That could be a comms problem. I've dealt with a lot of maintenance, so I never think it's the radio first off anymore. I think it's electrical. I think it's a fuse. I think it's an antenna. I think it's someone's headset. We troubleshot a radio for months, and it was because they had they had a light speed or something, and it was 1 millimeter shorter on the input than other headsets, so it wasn't quite making the connection.
Wow.
And it was brutally painful how hard we troubleshot that. But it's not, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is it may not always be the radio, and it may not always be the headset, and it may not always be the intercom.
Right.
So how are you going to decide, is this time the time that it's an emergency?
Yeah.
The other parameters have to come into play. We've talked about your halfway scenario and check rides. The question is a pretty one that I think we've explored. Let's talk through some other examples. What would you do? Would it be an emergency, I guess, if you were flying on a no ceiling day, perfectly calm, and you lost your radios in echo airspace between two cities?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. Do you divert? Do you pick up the phone, meaning cell phone, and call someone? There's a lot of options still there that you probably would not call that an emergency. Same scenario, foggy day, 200-foot ceiling, and you are 10 miles inbound for your final stop at a destination. Would you declare an emergency? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd be pretty nervous in that situation.
Right.
Did I just get cleared for the approach? That might change my situation. Would I squawk 7,600 versus 7,700? I don't know. Would it be, if I was alone, I would probably think it was an emergency.
Yeah.
I probably in that scenario would, if I only had zero communication with the tower at that point, I would probably squawk 7,700.
Yeah. And the thing about declaring an emergency, if you can't talk to anybody, you can't utter those words. You can't say, I declare an emergency. So basically, your only option is to use your transponder. And, of course, if there's a total electrical failure and you're in the clouds, your ability to navigate is going to be compromised. And obviously your ability to squawk 7,700 is compromised. So that's kind of a different situation, a total electrical failure.
Yeah, let's just hope it's the radio still in that scenario for sure.
Right.
But that could get hairy.
Yeah. I'm going back and looking at my flying career, a lot of hours. I can only think of one time where I said the words, I declare an emergency, and it was over a medical emergency. A passenger in the back. We were going into Los Angeles, and we were probably on about a 10 or 12 mile final approach, ILS or visual approach to 25 left, and we got a call from the back from the flight attendants that which we were in sterile cockpits, so the fact that they were calling us told me that something was it was pretty important, and I answered, and they said they had a customer who appeared to be not breathing, and they had him out on the floor, and they had a doctor, and they were performing CPR on him. And I just picked up, I was wearing a headset, so I just keyed the mic, and I said, we're declaring an emergency. We have a passenger who is unconscious and not breathing, and they switched us to the inboard runway, and it was amazing how fast they were able to get traffic out of our way. We got to the gate really fast, and I don't know if it was a time thing, but as I checked up, the guy was alive when he went in the terminal on the gurney with the paramedics. So that's just one example of an emergency we might not deal with in general aviation, but 24,000 hours, and you've declared one, which was not equipment, was not situational, was someone else that you were trying to take care of, shows that it's probably going to be few and far between, and that we'll never be ready for the one when it happens. But it's probably likely that we'll all declare one at some point. We talked about radios, and that turned into a little bit of electrical, but I mean, electrical is one that I think in these GA aircraft that I fly is the one that I think I'm going to experience at some time. It's not a matter of if, but more when. And when I do experience it, I think it's going to be those outside external factors that are going to decide whether or not I call or declare an emergency, depending on if I even can vocalize that emergency. In this example, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other questions that this person asked in their write-in to us. Maybe some timing of things. Like we simulate this engine failure a lot in check rides and in practice, and we do things, as we've discussed often, by the checklist and
7,700 is like number 19 out of 20. You joke and think that we should all move that up, which I got to agree that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Why? Let's talk through the reasons why squawking 7,700. If we decide to declare an emergency for an electrical failure or an engine failure, why does that make sense to do it earlier instead of later?
Well, 7700 is obviously a transponder code, and you get down too low, and the ground-based equipment that we're using to read transponder codes can't pick you up. So if I'm at my farm that's out in the middle of nowhere, and I got an airplane, and I go out and sitting on the ground, turn the transponder on, in all likelihood, air traffic control is not going to pick you up. They're not going to pick you up until you're in the air. And the longer they can see you on that code, just the better off. I've got FlightAware on my phone, which most of you probably do. I've got it set up to where I get a text if an airplane squawks 7,700 anywhere in the world. So I get these little text alerts, and it's very interesting because there's a lot of emergencies being squawked out there. And if you really want to get into it and try to research it, it gets a little cumbersome trying to figure out actually what happened. But it is kind of interesting. What I see when we practice this or evaluate this maneuver on check rides is maybe we're up at 3,000, 4,000 feet, something like that, and we simulate an engine failure. Well, most of our airplanes, we have two checklists we go through. The first checklist is the engine failure in flight checklist, say, and basically the gist of that checklist is trying to get the engine restarted. And almost everything on there has to do with fuel control, mixture, primer, carb heat, which really, I guess you could say, has a little bit to do with fuel. But the first checklist that we're trying to do is to get that engine restarted. And then typically, if the engine will not restart, we go into a landing without power or forced landing checklist or whatever the checklist may be called. And it has you shut things off. And usually toward the bottom of that checklist is squawking 7,700. So we wasted all this good time to where if we really had an emergency, we really lost the engine, maybe if we'd have squawked that 7,700 a little bit earlier, ATC could get a very good pinpoint of our location. Because if we go down, we want ATC to be able to tell the authorities where we are.
No doubt. There's the radios are pretty important at that time frame too, and we talk about it, and I think I practiced it, and I'm sure everyone that you evaluate goes through the same scenario of, okay, I've lost my electrical system, or I guess more in this case losing my engine. I want to change the radio to 1.5 because that's what I've been taught to do. Is that something that you would advise? If a student or a pilot thinks they're having an emergency, always to switch to 1.5.
I would say to switch to 1.5 if you don't know who else to talk to. If you're leaving, let's say, a Class D airport, and you are on the tower frequency, and you're heading away from the airport, let's say you're 15 miles out. You're technically out of the airspace of the Class D airport. But you still got the tower frequency tuned in. You've developed a contact with the tower, although you're leaving the airspace and you're perfectly free to leave the frequency. If I can call up and say, in our case, Hooks Tower, Cessna 123, 15 miles west, we just lost our engine. I'm just gonna stay with that guy. I'm not gonna try to reestablish a contact with another frequency on 120.15. But if you're not talking to anybody, 120.15 is always a good go-to place.
And a Delta, a Charlie, any tower is going to have the means to get you the help you need, right? They're just going to talk to the other people that may need to help you get what you need to get.
Right. Right.
The reason the reason I think I wouldn't change in this, obviously I'm talking to someone and I would want to be talking to someone, but I don't want to try to change it and get it wrong, you know?
Yeah, you might dial in 122.5 and you think you're talking to somebody, and 122.5, who knows what that is.
Yeah, that could be a time-sensitive scenario that you don't want to interact with for sure.
Right.
So let's talk through some of these electrical problems. We did an alternator and electrical system show a while back, but it was probably a month or so ago at the flight school here. We had an electrical failure of some sort. We weren't sure what. The student and CFI were in the plane. The CFI had a Bluetooth headset with a cell phone connected. Ultimately made contact with the tower as the radio started to get intermittent or weak. Obviously seeing that the battery's draining, the CFI made that phone call and was cleared to land over the phone. I believe he did squawk 7600. I was watching him on FlightAware because the tower alerted me that one of our planes had reported a radio problem. And at some point on FlightAware, he disappeared or stopped moving, was 1,400 feet in the air, so I knew he didn't just disappear, right? But his ADS-B signal must have quit working, so FlightAware didn't see him anymore. I walk out on the ramp. Shortly thereafter, he taxis in, gets out of the plane, and you can see he's elevated emotionally, right? Heart's pumping, and congratulate him on a job well done. He did not declare an emergency because it wasn't, right? I mean, we know the engine's not going to stop. Right. And I think I sent you a text and said, well, we finally had an alternator failure. And I think your response was something to the effect of, I bet it's not the alternator. And I was so sure this time that it was the alternator. I was about to bet on it. And guess what? It was not the alternator. The alternator was just fine.
What was it?
It was a wire on the back of the alternator that came off, right?
All right.
So the source of juice going to that battery had come undone, right?
Yeah.
It probably had been connected to that alternator for hundreds of hours, right?
Yeah.
And for one reason or another, wiggled out or came out of the joint that was in it. And I would have bet $1,000 that the CFI would have bet it was an alternator, because every symptom was that of a discharging battery that was no longer being charged, which it was, but it had nothing to do with the alternator. It just became disconnected.
That's interesting because, you know, if you look in the checklist, at least for Cessnas, the checklist is not alternator failure checklist. It's a low voltage checklist. So, you know, regardless of whether it's an alternator failure or, in this case, a wire, it is both low voltage.
Yes. So, in what case can you give us an example, Wally, of where an electrical problem may be an emergency? What would you think about and declare an emergency if it was an electrical failure or a low voltage scenario?
Yeah. Well, it first of all, I mean, if there's smoke involved, then there's fire, and that's absolutely an emergency.
Yeah, no question.
So that's the
one I fear the most.
Yeah,
no question.
Yeah. At this point, I think you have to know your airplane. You have to know your environment. If you're going into a place where you're having to fly an instrument approach, and all your navigation and communication radios are electrical, well, you've got a limited time. So you either need to fly toward good weather, or you need to expedite and get in. And the best way to expedite is to declare an emergency, just as I alluded to in my scenario going into Los Angeles. They expedited us extremely efficiently. But, there's a situation where if you're 15 minutes away from landing, you think you've got 30 minutes of battery. You may not. You may have 45. You may have 15. Who knows? But 30 minutes is the number that most of us come up with. You're supposed to have 30 minutes of battery life. And if you're 15 minutes away and you get vectors and now you're 35 minutes away, well, you can see there's a problem there. So every scenario is different, and outside influences, i.e. weather, and then knowing your airplane and how things are affected in your airplane by the loss of electricity. Some airplanes are going to lose flaps. Some airplanes are not going to lose the ability to move flaps.
All makes sense. All good tips. The next example we'll walk through is maybe not an engine failure, but what appears to be a sick engine. Something's running rough.
Yeah.
Something's amiss.
Yeah.
Is that something that you would immediately declare an emergency on?
I wouldn't say immediately, but I would certainly I would get my guard up, and I would probably it's hard to say. I mean, every scenario is different, but I am definitely looking for an airport to land at if I think I've got an airplane with an engine that's being sick. I mean, you could use the scenario of we've all had little stomach aches, and you may walk into a public building, and maybe the first thing you look for is, well, where's the restroom, just in case I need to get over there. So landing at an airport or figuring out an airport to go to, and in my airline career, I mean, I've never had the vast majority of issues we have, or I have had personally, are passenger related, and sick passengers. And the second we get that call up front about a sick passenger, man, the first thing we're doing is going down. We're looking for our closest airport and how quickly can we be there if we need to be. And I've diverted one time for a sick passenger, but most of the time you don't end up diverting. But we always had that option of where we were going to go and how quickly it would take us to get there.
And so a sick engine doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stop, but I guess as an experienced pilot, and I'm not that experienced, but I'm going to first think fuel. That's probably where my mind's going to go. I'm probably going to reach over and just naturally push that mixture in because I may have gone from high to low and not push that in, and that could be an indicator. It could be a fouled plug. It could be a lot of things, but my mind would then probably go to the magneto switch, right?
Yeah.
Like, have I lost a wire on my magneto? Is it grounded? Am I running on one? Is there something causing that? And I would probably go through left and right and both and see if I had something different.
Yeah.
Very possible. My chief has a real example of doing some maneuvers and the engine immediately got extremely rough. He describes it as the scariest thing that can happen to you in an airplane. And we've talked about an unbalanced engine, right? So now I'm running on one mag and it's extremely rough running. And he immediately reached over and switched it and everything was fine.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, he chose to declare an emergency that day. He thought, well, now I'm down to one magneto.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going to happen if I lose the other magneto, right? That's
right.
the only thing keeping the engine running at that point.
Yeah.
So he climbed, declared an emergency, came back home, landed without incident, and never had to do any paperwork, just the phone call with the tower to report what happened, and probably the owner of the flight school had to write a letter. But he talks about that as that emergency gave me all the better opportunity to get on the ground safely.
Yeah.
Climbing and going through Class Bravo airspace under an emergency situation is never going to be a problem. They're going to clear you out.
Yeah.
And he got to where he was high enough to where he could have taken the advantage of the glide ratio and if everything would have failed, made a normal landing here without power. So very interesting that it became something that was rectified. We would think is rectified. The roughness went away. The sick engine didn't seem to be a sick engine anymore. But that's when he declared the emergency, which I've always thought interesting and is in the back of my head that if I have that situation, I'll have that in my toolbox to possibly use as a reason to help me get on the ground safely.
Right.
I would go to the closest airport in many, many situations, obviously, if I couldn't resolve the sick engine. But one thing I talk about, and probably haven't talked openly with you, Wally, is my biggest concern is that someone has a cylinder problem. One of my biggest concerns is a student has a cylinder problem on a cross country, and they decide to put it down in a field because they don't really know how to diagnose that. They don't know how to understand what's going on, and they don't know the roughness is so scary that they take that opportunity to not understand if they still have airspeed and if they're holding lift and maintaining altitude and those sorts of things. I think it would have to be every scenario and everybody in that scenario to really be able to diagnose and go through what am I going to do here.
Right.
But I sure hope that a cylinder that's cracked maybe makes it seem extremely rough and bad, but still has enough power to create lift and could still get to an airport.
Yeah.
I just hope they don't choose a field when they could continue to fly the aircraft, although it's scary and rough.
Right.
Would you go through that process in your own aircraft? Would you think, am I creating enough power? This is really rough, but I'm able to stay in the air?
Yeah, because I know if I put it in a field, chances are very good we're going to significantly damage the airplane. And again, that's not a huge concern, but the chances are very good that we're going to hurt people on board the airplane landing in a field. I mean, obviously, the best place to land is your destination. Second best place to land is an airport short of your destination, and third is off airport.
Right.
So if you can limp that airplane to an airport, so that's why the first, as soon as I feel that there's an issue, boom, I'm thinking, where is my closest airport? And while I'm going to troubleshoot this, I'm going to be aiming at that airport.
Right. I just think airspeed and altitude are both key, and if you got them, I might keep going if I'm not seeing smoke and I'm not thinking more problems are happening.
Yeah.
But every situation is going to dictate a different response.
Yeah.
The last one we'll talk about that I've seen be an emergency, and I've seen it not be an emergency, is a bird strike.
Yeah.
We have some really big birds around here. I've seen a bird strike on the chord line of a wing that you would be impressed with how much damage a bird on the chord line of a wing can do. And I've seen a twin engine aircraft with a bird that went through the windshield and created a lot of blood and guts. And neither one of those, oddly enough, were declared emergencies. But were both significant to the pilots for sure. But there were reasons why they were really close to fields, and meaning airports, and they landed without incident. And I think that they still had comms, so they just talked themselves through it. But I can definitely see where a bird strike could be an emergency and a bird strike might not be an emergency.
Yeah. Part of it is just recognizing what happened. Because, unless the bird hits you head on, you may not really know what it is. You may just hear something. You may feel something if it's out on the wing. And, of course, by the time you have the wherewithal to look out at the wing, there may not be any evidence of it. There may be a dent or something like that. But it takes a while, and probably most of the people have watched the movie with Sully and the Miracle on the Hudson. They're talking about reaction time. And there is something to be said for that. It takes a while for the brain and everything to figure out, okay, what just happened? I know something happened, but I'm not really sure what happened. I think that could be an issue with a bird strike. I had one very early on in my career, and it hit right on the cowling and did quite a bit of damage to the front of the cowling. But we did see something, but it took a while to figure out that we hit a bird.
Yeah, calling out the Sully thing is a good one, because I thought it was interesting through that trial that they ultimately talked about that. And when they made those people wait, I think it was like 13 or 14 seconds, they all failed to accomplish the mission of getting back to the airport because it took just enough time for them not to be able to get there. And I don't know how I would react. If you watch any YouTube videos, it is shocking how fast a bird strike happens when it goes in through the windshield.
Yeah.
And then how much noise and damage and the emotions that you must be going through to think, I never thought I was going to fly an open canopy airplane.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you are with a dead bird in your lap.
Yeah.
It's going to change things. And I think each and every one of us will have to decide if it's an emergency or not.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess keep your wits about yourself, react, and then do what you can to land at an airport. That's number one for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if we answered everybody's questions as it relates to emergencies, but this was our first best step effort to answer your questions. If you have more things you would like us to cover on the show, please send us an email, bobby@behindtheprop.com or wally@behindtheprop.com. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at behindtheprop.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.